I'm gonna take some copper wire and a pile of cans and melt them into playable golf clubs. Then at the end, I'm gonna put them to the test and see how they perform. First step in this process is making some molds. Now I could have designed my own iron heads and cast those, but I decided on using my actual irons as templates so that I can compare side by side the performance of my self-created irons versus the Mizuno MP68s. I chose to make both an 8 iron and a 5 iron just so I have more to go off of in terms of testing. I used some modeling clay to fill in the logo and the brand name on the irons so that mine will come out unlabeled, even though I'm basically stealing the iron designs from Mizuno all in the name of experimentation. But for comparison's sakes, this made the most sense. I ultimately want to see how much worse my wire and can irons are than the Mizuno's. I'm not really a big golfer anymore. I play maybe a handful of rounds a year, but just like building a guitar and getting to play it afterward, the idea of making my own golf irons and then being able to test them out on the range is the same. And that's kind of the essence of what got me fired up for this project. I bought a cheap 8 iron that has the same size shaft from Played Again Sports, and I cut off the end of the shaft so that I could have a small portion that I can stick into the silicone mold, which will give me the hosel hole in the correct placement on the irons. Heated up some carving wax, which will get poured into the mold to hopefully give me a wax version of the 8 iron. This was my first time trying to create a wax plug of anything, so I didn't really know how to pour the wax clearly or how hot to get the wax. This was all kind of a learning experience for me. Had to use a soldering iron to just slightly heat up the shaft so that the wax would release from it. First attempt, and it came out looking like an iron in terms of its shape. It's got a little air pocket here and then just tons of micro bubbles or aeration in the wax. It's a lot better on the hosel where it's thinner. Maybe I just got the wax too hot. I poured this one without heating up the wax as much, and the bubbles are gone, which is good. The finish actually looks really good. The hosel didn't fill in completely, so I gotta try again. So I gave numerous more attempts. I tried pouring the wax in from a different inlet on the mold, and that didn't seem to help much. What I ultimately did was reduce the amount of the shaft that was sticking into the mold, which did help fill in the hosel area. And after about 8 or 9 attempts, I had finally made a wax iron that I was happy with. I'm gonna try investment casting these irons, which means that I'll have to figure out how to get this iron head inside of this flask with a sprue and some vent lines to cast it. This is pretty much the biggest flask I can fit in my kiln, so the only option was to try and fit the club head in this flask. I made a short and stout sprue, which is where the metal will flow into the mold. And then I also attached on a few vents to the club head, which will help release air as the mold fills with metal. I mixed up some investment powder, which only has like 6 or 7 minutes before it begins setting up. So this was kind of a frantic process for me, especially considering this was my first time attempting investment casting. The investment is a mixture of silica and binders like gypsum, which allows it to be heated up to really high temperatures. It is nasty stuff though, definitely don't want to be breathing it in. I pulled the air out of the investment mixture and started to fill in the flask with my wax 8 iron in it. At this point, I'd already really screwed up the process. As you can see, my wax 8 iron is starting to float in the investment, which for how much research I did on this process, nowhere did I learn that I needed to attach the wax piece to the base of the flask. Looking back on it, it makes total sense. Obviously, wax is lighter than the mixture, so I feel really stupid about that one. Fortunately, I was able to get to the hose in time and blast off the investment, so at least I can still reuse my wax 8 iron. Now that I knew I had to connect it to the base, I went ahead and soldered on some wax to attach it, and then I put it back in the flask and gave it another shot. This time it didn't float and I was able to put it back into the vacuum and suck the air out of the flask. It's early in the morning. Got my invested flask with the wax in it. I'm gonna pop it in the kiln where it'll be slowly heated up all day. Looks like the roof popped off this thing, and yeah, that's not right. New wax 8 iron. I'm gonna try this again. Got this thing invested, added about an inch to the top of the flask so there's more material over the hosel. It'll be a tight fit in the kiln, but hopefully this works. I'm gonna put it in the kiln and hopefully when I open it up tonight, it'll still be in one piece. I cut up some copper wire to melt down, got my stash of cans down from the rafters and started melting these down. The copper I can use right away because it's generally clean wire. For the aluminum though, I have to melt down the cans first and remove all the junk that's on the cans to get relatively pure aluminum. Cans aren't really a good source of aluminum because there's just so much extra junk on them, but I've got a big stash of cans so I'd figure I'd use them, even if it is a bit more work. The metal I'll be making the irons out of is called aluminum bronze. It's a mixture of about 90% copper and 10% aluminum by weight. I was surprised to find out that there actually were golf irons made of different types of bronze in the past. There's some made out of beryllium copper, which is actually a type of bronze. Yamaha, of all companies, and Cobra had iron sets in the 80s, I think, that were made out of aluminum bronze. So I'm not exactly inventing anything new here, but the fact that there were previously irons made from this type of metal was promising in terms of creating some actually playable golf clubs. When I did my research for this project, I was astonished at the lack of videos about the making of golf clubs. I could only find one video on the entirety of YouTube showing the casting process of golf irons. There's quite a few videos of companies forging or pressing irons, but there's literally only one video, which is a 90s how it's made video, showing Ping's Golf Factory casting irons. So that was pretty much my reference point for this entire project, and I'm basically recreating their steps to create a golf iron, albeit on a much smaller scale. So now it's like 9 o'clock at night and the flask is finally ready to get poured. This is a long process in terms of getting to this point with each flask I invest, so I was really crossing my fingers that this pour was going to come out clean. Alright, next morning, and the top piece of the investment popped off, but that doesn't really matter now. I'm gonna soak this flask and then see what I've got. Got my aluminum bronze 8 iron and it looks pretty good. Got the vents and sprue cut off and it still needs a lot of cleaning up. One of the main flaws I see on this is that the grooves got filled in here near the toe for some reason. Not really sure why this happened, but I can probably fix it later. Thankfully the 8 iron turned out good, so I recreated the process on the Mizuno 5 iron. Got that invested in the flask. Got some more copper and aluminum, melted that down. I started the process at like 4 a.m. this time, so I was able to pour this one still in the daylight. And I thought I might have poured this one with the bronze not hot enough because it poured kind of chunky. So I was worried that the mold didn't fill all the way, and that would have set me back another few days. But fortunately it did fill, but it does have some flaws. The 5 iron came out pretty good. It's got a different color than the 8 iron, probably because I quenched this one. It looks kind of cool actually. The grooves filled in here on the upper side. I'm not sure why that's happening. The grooves must be falling off in the investment for some reason. I'll try fixing these later, but for now it looks good enough to move forward. Alright, check this out. I was not expecting this. So the Mizuno 5 iron weighs 254 grams. The bronze 5 iron, 234 grams. That's 20 grams lighter, and I still gotta drill out the rest of the hosel and grind off the rest of the metal here. I know aluminum bronze is a relatively lighter bronze alloy, but I wasn't expecting that much. 8 iron, 277 grams for the Mizuno, 260 for the bronze, and I still gotta clean this one up too. That's a big discrepancy, so I'm thinking some of the weight difference is due to metal shrinkage while cooling. I'm not sure if you can visually see it, but the hosel on the bronze iron is slightly thinner, so I think metal shrinkage is at least a small factor too. First thing I had to do was finish drilling out the hosel to fit the shafts. And I did this by clamping the hosel in the chuck. Since the hosel is cylindrical, it should give a pretty good reference point to drill straight down into it. And then I used a cradle vise attached to the drill press table to clamp the iron head, and I released it from the chuck, dropped the table down, and installed a 9.4mm drill bit. Most steel golf shafts have a slight taper from 0.370 to 0.350 at the tip. I don't have a way to drill in that taper, so I'm just gonna use shims on the shafts to get that taper, which is, I guess, a pretty common way to fit a shaft. I had to do some filing on the logo on the back because there was a bit showing in the casting still. Cleaned them up with the sander and gave them a light sandblasting using 180 grit abrasive. Now to fix the grooves, I used a Dremel and just set up a little fence parallel with the grooves and used that to delicately cut the rest of the grooves that were missing. I think this worked out pretty good. I just can't get a 90-degree slot on the ends of the grooves since I'm using a wheel, but it's good enough for me. Polished them up on a couple different wheels to bring them to a nice golden shine. The Mizunos have like a matte face where the grooves are, and so I'm gonna try to replicate that finish by just taping off the sides and sandblasting the face. Got the iron heads glued onto their shafts and the collars snugged up. I'm using Dynamic Gold S300 stiff shafts for these clubs, which are the same shafts that are on my Mizunos. So I'm just trying to keep the variables down to the club heads themselves. And I'm using the same grips too, actually. Okay, here we have it. Some aluminum bronze irons made from wire and cans. Got them gripped up. I think the glue is set, so I'm gonna go give them a rip.
Oh yeah, I chunked that one.
I crushed that one.
Oh, I don't think it went very far.
What?
Pitching wedge.
Went to the end of the thing.
Yeah, that's only like 112 yards.
Time to find out how far I can actually hit these things. I've got my bronze irons, TrackMan launch monitor, TV to see all the data, and a wide open range. So let's see what these irons do. For every shot I hit, I get all that data on the screen right in front of me. I started out with the Mizuno 8 iron and got all my numbers for that. I tried to hit around 10 or 12 balls with each club and then crunch the numbers, so what I'm showing you is the averages for each metric. I included dynamic loft in here, which is the angle of the club face at impact, which is pretty important metric for this test. Switched over to the bronze 8 iron, and the first thing to notice is that my swing speed is up 2.4 miles an hour, which is due to the lighter head weight. But my carry is down 6 yards, distance is down 7.7, ball speed is down 2 miles an hour, spin rate is up 673, and that's probably mostly due to the 2.2 degree increase in dynamic loft versus the Mizunos, but the spin rate might also be attributed partly to the difference in steel versus bronze, given that softer metals can add a slight increase on spin rate. The Mizunos are pretty soft feeling irons already, but the bronze irons are noticeably softer in feel, which was a pretty cool revelation. Now onto the 5 iron, where once again I hit the Mizuno first just to get a baseline to compare to. I mentioned earlier how the bronze irons are significantly lighter than the Mizunos, probably due to metal shrinkage, so they're actually a bit smaller too, though I wouldn't really say they're any harder to hit than the Mizunos. Here's the metrics for the bronze 5 iron, and one major point I want to make is that if you zoom in on the club head, you'll start to see a gap forming between the collar and the head. I noticed this and I thought maybe the collar had just popped loose and rode up the shaft a bit, but it wasn't. The club head was pretty much coming off this entire test until it eventually did fall off. Okay, there it goes. Well, still managed to hit it 167 yards, but the club head flying off, so that was pretty cool. So I only got 7 or 8 hits with the 5 iron, and the metrics might not be the best representation for its performance. I have a feeling it's not as far off in carry and distance as the numbers show.
Thank you. Yeah, you got it.
All right, well, I guess that concludes my testing here. I think I probably hit these clubs too soon after gluing them the first time and never let them set properly, which is why the 5-iron popped off. Guess I was just too excited to give them a rip. Re-glued both club heads just to be safe, and they lasted a bucket of balls so far, so I think they're good to go. Took these clubs out on the par 3 course, and my final thoughts, they're not as good as the Mizunos, but they play pretty well and they feel really good. They play like actual golf clubs. I hit them maybe slightly higher than the Mizunos, which is probably mostly due to the loft angles being slightly off. But overall, I'm pretty happy with how these came out. I think it'd be cool to design my own irons next time and really try to dial in the weight and loft angle and make sure the head doesn't pop off again, and see if I can make some reasonably competitive irons from scratch. Anyways, that's it. Thanks for watching.